Okay, good morning or late morning. Thank you for coming to this, did I say 6th annual Swedish APL user meeting? We try to keep a theme going for these meetings to have a common subject and get various people's views on it and exchange ideas that way. And we did a few on cloud-oriented subjects like web services and what was the other one? The first couple of themes was parallel computing.
Parallel computing.
And after 2 or 3 events, I ran out of ideas. But I think we've managed to pick a good subject for this year as well, which is about managing projects in APL and how to create an APL project and managing source code in APL, and also collaborating with non-APLers on developing applications. So how do we integrate various programming languages into a project and manage all the parts, moving parts in that? My own view on this was, and I think I'm not alone, that when you start out with APL, there aren't that many structures in place to help you with libraries and templates of how to do things. There are resources for idioms. There are resources for help manuals on the interpreter itself, but the library community was very missing. And part of the problem was that there wasn't any framework in place to help standardize how people should share code. And of course, intrinsic in APLers, I was told from day one that APLers like to do it their way, and they don't really want to use anyone else's code because they don't.
Also, before the advent of namespaces, there were scoping issues that were, I mean, there are still scoping issues, but before namespaces came along, the scoping issues were such that they actually really stopped people from sharing code. Today, things are much better.
So this day, the topic is that, APL projects and how to manage libraries and develop applications in APL. Thank you all for coming. I will start off by handing over to Morten, who you all know.
You'll be back.
And I will sit back somewhere else and keep an eye on the meeting.
Yeah, thank you. So my task today is really to warm up for Gil, who's been taking a step back really and looking at this problem of project management, dependency management, and so on. Also based on his experience of not just using APL, but Gil has been working with Visual VS Code and NPM package manager and gaining experience. So Gil really has one leg on each side of the wall here, and I think that's going to be very, very valuable to us. I'm going to spend about an hour telling you a little bit about adventures of sort of my own walk towards some of the things that I think Gil actually now has a higher level view of. Anyway, I usually start with a picture of the granddaughter at this point, but since we're streaming live, I can't do that. The parents have a ban out on her appearing on the internet. So I'll show you how I spent my Easter instead. This is Rødbyhavn, which is about 20 hours sailing south of here, and I spent Easter clearing the snow and sailing back here, and then 3 days recovering from the cold that I got as part of that. So that's my excuse if any of this is ill-prepared. Anyway, I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we've been doing. We needed to use APL in APL source code in text files over the past decade, and we've been building tools as we went along. As I said, it's really warming up for Gil. First, I'm going to start by motivating, well, is that necessary? How many people here are not yet convinced that having APL source in text files is obviously the right thing to do? Who's completely convinced that's a good idea? Who is sort of warming up? Okay, anybody still think that workspace is the best thing ever invented? And get is not voting. She's just recording things. Anyway, so maybe I don't need to spend much time on that. It seems most people are getting the message. I'm going to then recount a little project I've been working on where I've been working with source code in 2 languages, so converting a Python application to APL. So I've been using the PyCharm IDE, which is how most, I think, Python programmers do Python programming today, to learn from that. And then I'm going to try and cover 3 user commands that we've been working on in the last couple of years in particular. One that simply creates a link between a namespace in your active workspace and a folder, and sort of gives you a parallel structure of namespaces and folders and keeps them in sync. And then a couple of things that are sort of straying into the area that Gil's going to be talking about, user commands to build distribution environments and test things. So these are more over in the project management side of things, whereas the link is really just a low-level tool that you say should really be built into the interpreter. So the idea of storing APL code in text files is not really new. Here's a piece of Archaeological PL code that was recovered from a script file. How many of you remember branching times iota condition to L2B, which is down on line 471 of a function? Not that long ago, some people in the community started talking about this. This is a presentation that I did 10 years ago. Started pushing this idea of, this was when, it's part of a presentation I did on the Unicode version of Dialog-APL, which was when we really started moving in this direction. And to show the real benefit of moving into this world is that you can start taking advantage of third-party tools. So this is a tool called Compare It, which was written by people who never ever heard of APL, I'm sure. And yet, as soon as we put our source code out in text files, their tool would do diffs for us and color them nicely and show the differences. And we're reaching a point now where we really have an opportunity to take advantage of a lot of tools out there for doing this. This is sort of the simplest thing, doing a diff, but then building this continuous deployment that everybody's talking about today, which is really how we've been working for a long time, but getting it done systematically with state-of-the-art tools. So, use mainstream source code management systems, easily share code, collaborate. This is Microsoft Outlook. We can have APL source code. One day, Adam is working on a proposal for array literals. So this here is a proposal for how you would write in an APL source file the array 3, 4, reshape iota 12. So you have these square brackets here showing the structure. That's actually in some ways the last big missing link that we currently have for working with source code. We have the actual functions and classes and so on in text files. We don't yet have a good way to put constants from our applications into text source. And that's one of the things I see as a big challenge for the next year, actually. That's right at the top of our team list. Anyway, one thing which I think, most people raised their hands who I said, we're sold on this. I think this is true not only for software engineers, right? This is going to be true also for the people we see as our classical audience, the domain experts. So people who've learned statistics at university or chemical engineering. They will have used R or Python or some scripting language, and they will all be used to using GitHub. Our daughter just started work as a project manager, and she's using GitHub. Everybody just gets thrown straight into using these tools from day one, whether they are software engineers or working in other parts of software development. Okay, so hopefully that's accepted, and the rest of you, the other two, will give us the benefit of the doubt a little longer. So I've been working on this project for the last 2-3 months with Romilly Cocky, who's he was an APL programmer. I think he formed the British APL Association. When was that? Yeah, don't want to remember dates like that. he went off into Smalltalk and Python. And now in the last few years, seeing how the APL environment is developing, he's decided he wants to get back into APL because it's looking like something he could use again. The integration and the tooling is starting to be where he wants to be. So I've been working with him to show him what APL can do these days, but also for us at Dialogue to gain some experience of using Python and the Python tools. Because I think if we look out there for where the next generation of APL users are likely to come from, I think a good portion of them are people who are using Python today to do various kinds of data mining or scientific computing. The R programmers, MATLAB programmers, and the Python programmers are the people we need to understand and make sure that our tools are going to satisfy them. Yep, so Romilly is an electronics geek as well. He likes to construct circuits, make blinking lights and drive robots and stuff like that. And he very often uses these things called breadboards, which are, I don't know if you've ever seen any of these, but they're little pieces of plastic in various sizes. And they have wires underneath the surface, beneath these holes. And then you can, rather than making an actual printed circuit board, you can just plug things in, and anything that's in this column of 5 holes is going to be connected together. And there's a big gap in the middle, so you can put chips in, and then you can very quickly prototype circuits. And what Romilly wants to do is he wants to have a tool where you can have a domain-specific notation to describe a breadboard, and then it draws a picture of it, and it prints out instructions for how to construct it. Take the printed circuit, so take the chip, put it in the middle, insert the resistor with these colored stripes into these
like
holes.
Lego instructions.
Sorry?
Like building Lego.
Yes, exactly. And because he was using Python when he started, it's a Python project and it's out there on GitHub. And so he suggested, why don't we see if we can rewrite this in APL, and you'll learn something and I'll learn something. So we've been working on that. And I don't know, any Python programmers here? Is PyCharm, is it correct that that's sort of the most widely used Python IDE today? Nobody knows.
You're the only one using it?
I'm the only one using it. So Romilly has the professional edition. I installed the community edition, and I checked out, I cloned his GitHub repository, and off we went. So let me just spend 5 or 10 minutes showing you what that experience is. So let's see, where is PyCharm? Here it is. So the GitHub repository sort of corresponds to a folder. I think, he'll correct me if I'm wrong, the model we're really working towards is that a software project is a folder.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we've checked out this thing. I cloned it from GitHub into C devt breadboarder. And then below there, he has documentation, and he has a folder where he collects the SVG output, the graphical output, the drawings of these things. And then he has a source folder, which now has 2 subfolders. He split that up, so he's got the Python code in one folder. There's, he's got 6 or 7 source files. And then we created an APL folder where we started putting the APL classes and so on that corresponded to that. So where he wants to get to, this is sort of his domain-specific notation here. He makes so this CP2102 is, I think, the name of some breadboarder project. He has various variables he can set to define the dimensions of this thing. And then he says, well, add a rectangle, add a socket group, and so on. So this is like his DSL in Python, adding these various components. And then the end result is that drawing that we saw of the breadboard. And what we did then was we sat down and we decided that we would, we haven't gotten any further in APL yet than just being able to draw the breadboard with the squares. We can't actually put any components on it. But the way we went about it was we took his draw breadboard program which has these lines of code here. We say, well, you make a rectangle, which I guess is the whole thing, and then you add a power group at the top, which is the two sets of rows. Sorry, the positive power at the top, and there's a negative power at the bottom one, top and bottom. There's numeric labels, body sockets, and we just started by having only one line here, just the top line, commented all of the rest out. And then we wrote an APL program to do that, and we compared the output. If we look at his definition of rectangle here, it's not really important to look at the details of that. He's got a rectangle class, and then of course we wrote a rectangle class in APL as well. So here we're looking at APL code in the PyCharm interface, right? But you see, it's even with without using the APL font, it's rendering quite okay. Yeah, and with the dialog IME, I can go in here, staying inside PyCharm, and I can say default, just type something, including an APL comment symbol. Yeah, but of course, I don't want to do that. I want to work in APL. So I start up my APL session. And what I type now with this new link command that we have is that I'd like to take that APL part of the source, and I'd like to create a link to the root of my workspace. Yeah. So as soon as I've done that, you can see the APL source here, folder. As soon as I've done that, I can see that I have two of those things were functions, these two tests, draw breadboard, and the rest of them are objects. And my test draw breadboard, I'll just run that to show, so we would, we translate another little piece of Python code into APL, and then we'd run this test draw breadboard, which does the following. This is the same code as his creating the breadboard. Create a breadboard, move it to 2020, add the breadboard to the project, and then there's an SVG method which runs and produces a vector of SVG, which says how a web browser or something should draw this. And then, oh, I forgot to show, one of the nice things about the Python environment is you have this configuration where you say, well, as I work on my code, this is the test that I want to run. So that's configured up there, and every time you've changed some code and you want to run the test, you just click on the run button here, and it creates the, we can't actually see the name of the file it created, but the name of the file it created is this thing on the next line of code here. So I read in the SVG that was created by the Python program, and I have my own SVG that I created, and now my test consists of finding out whether they were the same, right? And I create a form, I add an HTML renderer, and I put my own SVG inside it. And then I create another form next to it, and I put the Python SVG into it. You can see they are obviously identical. Maybe you're not convinced. This isn't actually how we were comparing them. That was a joke that I added late last night. Oh, I forgot to point out that if I look at this rectangle class, you can see that that comment that I typed in PyCharm is there in the workspace. So that's instantaneous. Yeah, and if I decide I didn't like that, or I want it to be capital W white, yeah, I go back to, where's the mouse? Go back to Python. You can see it's capital W. In APL, I actually have to leave the editor. PyCharm, they've taken that so far that it just updates the file as you type. As soon as you make a 5-second pause, it updates the file. And this is something that we've gone through a very long cycle on the APL side of convincing ourselves that that's the right thing to do. Because first we had, you have to save it, and then you have to explicitly say you want to do it. But that's because we're stuck in the old way of doing things. The thing that you need to remember that underneath this, Git is managing the source code. So when you want to commit it to the source code management system, you go to Git and say, right, now I'd like to save a snapshot. And the source code on the file is simply what you're working on. It's not a separate copy of it. It is the same thing. And you actually want this to be as immediate as possible. But I mean, I can see some of you wrinkling your noses. We struggled. It took us, I don't know, a couple of months, I think, to get through this, of having it pop up every time. Say, oh, do you really want to update the file? Are you sure? Yes, yes, I want to update the file. And then I worked with PyCharm, and I discovered that that's just stupid. You just want it to update. And I want, you know, I want the change in APL. I can't go the other way here now because there's a bug in version 17 that I got yesterday. If I change this, it's going to crash with the Sysera 999 as it tries to bring the change in. But the important thing is that it's immediate, right? We're two people working on the same project. If somebody makes a change in the PyCharm IDE and pushes it to GitHub and I pull it, it's immediately there in my workspace. If I'm using both editors on the same system, I'm editing the same code in PyCharm and in Dialog Editor, and I don't want any admin. Now, the way we're really comparing them is I've created two little dfunds, and I'll explain what they do. Here's the same code as before. I make my project. I get the SVG and I get the Python SVG. I pass it through QuadXML. I pass both of them through QuadXML. And then I get this array representation of the SVG. And that's something that we can very easily compare in APL because we've got two matrices. It turns out you really can't see that? All right, it looks like this. Yeah, so I mean the SVG is an XML format, right? And it has all, you know, here's the beginning of the document. It's 480 by 640. There's a group with a name, there's a rectangle, there's a line, there's text, and so on. Right? So that's the description of it. And I want to compare these in what APL produced and what Python produced and convince myself that they're the same. And I needed to add these two little helper functions because there were two problems. That the SVG was almost identical. The problem was Python was formatting the number with lots of trailing zeros, and APL wasn't. And the other thing was that these were in, I think, alphabetical order in the Python-generated SVG, and they were not in alphabetical order in the APL. So these two functions here, called sort styles and fixed trailing zeros, just basically go in, find out where the numbers are, and format them in APL for both of them. And then here there's some sorting by the name of the styles. And then we're done. Yep. Oh, and it returned it all. Didn't mean to do that. The actual expression you want to run is first test. Okay, so I mean, this has been a very valuable exercise for me. I mean, I've learned, I think particularly on the IDE, not so much Python. I mean, Python has some nice things. For example, when you, this is perhaps the biggest, the nicest thing about Python that I wish we had in APL, is that you can have a function header. This is a constructor for a text. You can say, well, there's going to be the text and the starting position. And then there's going to be color with a default value of black and an anchor with a default value of start. And when you make the call, you can use these names in the header. Whereas in APL, you end up writing, I'm sure you've all written something like this, which says text start color anchor size is the 5 take of args concatenated with the tally of args drop and then an array with default values. And you have to provide them in that order. You can't use the name order. The nice things about APL, I mean, really, it's when you're working on the points, right? If you want to find the top left, you take the center of the text. Now, if you want to set the center, yeah, to a point, you take the point and then you subtract 0.5 times the extent of the text box. Whereas in Python, you're doing all the rest side of self-width and self-height, multiplying each one separately by 0.5. Of course, at the end of the day, the really nice thing about APL was actually the ability to test the cases. I think Romilly said if he had to write this in in Python, that would have been a major chore. Whereas this function took me about 15 minutes from beginning to start, including understanding the problems and fixing them in APL. These things look a little bit complicated, but with experimentation in APL, it's really, really fast to throw something like this together, to sort out this kind of differences in two data formats and convince yourself at the end of the day that match reduce omega is true. Yep. So, I mean, being able to share the source in two different languages in the same project, because this is a little bit synthetic, right? We weren't actually trying to write a project that used the two languages, but I know that many of you are writing systems that contain a combination of APL, C#, JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and so on. It's very nice to be able to use different editors that really understand the different formats, or debug the different formats. Yeah. So it's made it really easy for us to work together, because the APL code is now out on Romilly's project, so that if anybody who wants to, and they don't need an APL interpreter to read it, because it's just text files, and GitHub does a reasonable job of rendering them, even if you don't install any fonts. And the link user command really allowed me to work interactively. So, I mean, the important thing here is I didn't have to change the way that I worked as an APL programmer at all. Right? I was there in the workspace. I was dynamically tracing, editing, creating new functions, creating variables. I didn't have to get into any kind of edit, compile, debug loop. I could work in exactly the same way as before, but the system was taking care of saving my changes, giving me audit trail because we were using GitHub. I could push it, and Romilly over in the UK could immediately see it. If he made any changes, all I had to do was a git pull. I didn't and type nothing in APL. I do a git pull, and the changes appear. I'll demonstrate that actually in another little demo in a minute, how that works. So this was really quite joyful and nice experience. So the real subject of this talk, of course, is the link user command. The title was linking your code, which Gil kindly gave me as a working title, I think.
Did I? Oh, linking your code.
Linking
yes.
your code. Yeah.
I thought you meant the name.
Oh no, the name was map originally, and then it became link. And we're still arguing about what the name should be, because that depends a little bit on how you think about it. But what link does is it takes two parameters. One is the namespace, and the other is the name of a folder in the file system. And it assumes that every function, operator, class, or a script namespace in the workspace will correspond exactly to one external file. And you notice variables are missing here, and I mentioned that earlier. As a priority for version 18, having a structure or a syntax, for declaring constants, not variables, but the things that you think of constants that are really part of the source code of your application. Tables with error codes and enums and so on. We need to be able to have them in source. And yeah, let's see if we can do a demo which just focuses on that user command. Let's see, that's this APL session, maybe. Right. So I have a little application folder. It's called an app, temp an app, and it's got a function, two functions in it, and a very strange thing. This you can see. This is the side effect of not having a syntax for arrays. This is a trick I've learned from. Oh, thank you. Oh, that's nice. John tells me there's a new executable for me. I think I will not pick it up now. Yeah, fixes the crash, yeah. So this is a trick I learned from Paul Mansour and the folks using Acre, is that you define a namespace and then ## dot all the system variables you set. The act of fixing that defines these variables in the space above. So it is a notation, if you like, for array constants, in a sense, but we'll do something better than that. So in my workspace, having done the link, I have start and I have get greeting. So start, right, and I think I opened these up in, this is in fact the world's most widely used IDE. Did you know that? Something called Notepad++. So they did a statistic recently. It's not VS Code. It's not any of the things you would expect. Notepad++ is the world's most widely used development environment. And we'll be working on getting syntax coloring for APL in place there. So I've got a function called start.dialog. And of course, we're in the wrong place. It's not Helsinki where I did this demo the first time. It's Malmö. Oh, and I've got a problem with my...
You may use the data.
IME. There we go. Yeah. Malmö, correctly spelled. Yeah.
I'm already impressed.
And as soon as I hit save there, say Notepad++ doesn't do this saving all the time. You have to hit the save button. If I now edit this in a... Oh, did I save it? Yeah, I did. That's not right. No, it is. Oh, okay. I don't know why that didn't work. Yeah, so get greeting Malmö. And if I run that, value error, undefined name utils, that's right, because I forgot that in addition to my own code, I'm using a utility library, which is in fact a GitHub repository out there. And I have it checked out, so I'm just going to link that. And now I can run that. Yeah, ta-da. So I mean, there isn't much to show here really, because if you change something, it just changes, right? We decided we couldn't use that, but we had to use this. Then if you go back here, okay, so Notepad++ does pop up and ask you if you want to reload it, which is sometimes very useful because you've destroyed it accidentally. Yeah. If I edit a new function, this is, if any of you have used Salt with this and loaded a folder into APL using Salt, this was sort of the one thing that it didn't do. If you created a new function, it didn't know how to immediately put that into the folder. But the link knows how, when you create a new function, this is true, Salt doesn't know how to put it. Adam's looking very mystified. Yeah. When you create a new function, if you've used Salt to load, you have to do an explicit save to put it into the folder where it came from. It's true. Yeah. But link, if I were to create a sub namespace here, new folder, no, not data, stuff, and then I would have, oh, it hasn't created, oh no, I have to actually put a file in there. So let's take a copy of foo. This is how people would create a new function anyway, isn't it? They take a copy of foo, they'd go into stuff, they'd insert it, they'd edit it and change that to goo. So now we temporarily have a file that contains goo but has the wrong name, and then they would rename it to goo. And now hopefully
I'm totally lost. What are you doing?
I took the file foo.dialog, which contained the function foo.
I mean, where are you? What are you doing?
This is Windows Explorer, right? This is a folder containing the source code of my application that I linked into the workspace. The start function, the get greeting function, and I added a new function. Yeah. I then created a folder which should map to a namespace in my workspace. Yeah. Then I took the foo function, so the file containing the foo function. I copied it into the stuff folder. I renamed it. First I changed its content so that it defined the function goo. And then I renamed it to goo. So I'm working with my APL source code using Windows Explorer as my IDE. And with a bit of luck, I'll have, it didn't work. Why didn't that work? It was working yesterday, honest. Yeah. Okay, so I should have had a namespace there with the function goo in it, and I don't know exactly why that didn't work. It could be an artifact of all sorts of things. But I mean, that's the idea. You can make changes, you can change the structure, and the link system is going to make sure that whether you make the changes inside the workspace or outside in the folder, you're going to see the same things happening.
Function would then be in a namespace or in a namespace script, or?
It would be in a namespace. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do a link reset. And I'm going to do that again. So since I reset the link and then I said, okay, now link the root to an app again. Since there was stuff in both places, it's being a little bit paranoid and it's asking me to say which one of them I want to consider to be the source. Right? We could, and I think the original version of this just looked at them and tried to see what was the newest thing and update them. But at the moment, we've decided to be a bit conservative and not do that. So now, hopefully, I have stuff.goo. Yeah, so it's just a function. Yeah, so there's a one-to-one mapping between functions, classes, and scripted namespaces. So if it's a scripted namespace, which is something you control, then it becomes a single file. If it's an unscripted namespace, it becomes a folder in the file system, and whatever's inside it is represented one-to-one. So you decide whether you want your namespace to be a single file or individual files. When we started out, Dan and I on SALT about 10 years ago when that first slide appeared, we assumed that everybody would want to script things because we had this newfangled object-oriented stuff and we thought that's what people wanted to do. The experience has shown very clearly that APL programmers see the function as the unit of work. They want to see one function, one file, which is different from how almost any other programming language would want to see it. Other people like to think of a class or maybe a partial class with some collection of a dozen functions. That makes it easier for them, I guess. I mean, since they have GitHub or tools like that to help them, they can actually see things at a finer granularity. And it may be that the APL community will gravitate in that direction over the next decade or two as it gains more experience with source code management tools. Most of us don't really understand Git yet. I've played with it a bit, but I wouldn't claim to understand it. So Gita, was that more, is it clear what's going on here? Yeah? There's a namespace structure in the workspace, which looks like this. Yeah. No, it doesn't. This has got nothing to do with GitHub. This links the workspace to a folder. Yeah. Or two folders in this case. I linked my application was this folder called temp an app. Yeah. This is not managed by GitHub. It's just a folder on my hard disk. Yeah, the link system doesn't care about GitHub. It's never heard of GitHub, doesn't know the first thing about it. It just establishes a mapping between your workspace and a folder structure, an identical structure, namespaces, file folders. I mean, is that a difficult concept to?
Do you have to work in two different ways? If you work in GitHub or if you work
No.
on your own?
And I'm glad you asked that question because the other link that I created, yeah, I had two links. The other one was this one here, where I said link utils to, I have to do the same thing. Wants to know source equals directory. Yep. That folder.
But if you create a new function in the workspace,
yeah,
and you have two links, and you say it will synchronize with the external.
You can't have the same namespace linked twice. That would be very confusing. Yeah, so I've got the if I type link here, it says I've got the root map to an app, and I've got hash.utils map to this. These numbers here seem a bit strange, but it's a prototype.
So
right?
how does it know if you create a new namespace?
If I create a new namespace within one of these, it will look for the parent and create it within them. I mean, there may be bugs in that, right? We haven't tested this thoroughly. It's still a prototype. But it looks where you're working inside, and it creates it there. There's a little bit of potential for confusion here, because this is a sub-namespace of that. And I don't know that the rules are really very clearly defined, but it's fairly easy to see. If you're inside here, then it's that, and if it's not, then it's the containing one. So Gitter, this one is not a GitHub managed folder. Yeah, this one is a GitHub managed folder. It makes no difference to the APL programmer whether it's GitHub managed or not in terms of how he works in APL. Right? He can go in and edit utils, strings. I happen to know there's a function called lowercase. Say, oh, using new iBeam. Cool. Yeah. So if I edit that, it saves it to the file. Now.
But I mean, I'm very low practical.
Yeah.
It's pointing to your C drive.
Yeah.
So how is it in GitHub?
Okay, that's separate. Whether you have mapped one of your folders to GitHub is a matter for GitHub and you. But those things are completely independent. The link mechanism doesn't care whether a folder that you map is mapped to GitHub or not. In this case, one of them is, and the other one isn't. Right?
I think I would lose track of my phone.
No. If you use GitHub, the one thing you will not do is lose track of your code, because here's a tool called SourceTree, which is for managing GitHub repositories. And I have checked out Kromberg utils. Yeah. And you see, here is a list of all the changes that I've made. Actually, I created that for Dia-Og13. And then I started reusing it for this demo. And you see, it says uncommitted changes. Yeah. Ooh, what's that? Uncommitted changes. Ah, there's the file strings.dialog. And if you click on that, it says, oh, look, here's the old code in red with a minus, and the change where Morten typed using new iBeam cool with a plus. So if you want to track the changes and get this kind of overview, you would use a tool that's designed for that. Right? We shouldn't reinvent this tool inside APL when all it's going to do is exactly this, and there are already people who've spent hundreds of millions of dollars. Sorry? Can you start again? I didn't hear the beginning.
How do you see? I mean, if you just
Can I respond?
Yeah, okay, yeah, sure.
And you want to copy it,
GitHub.
and then it just gets changed on GitHub, and everybody else has a different version.
If you think of the folder on the file system as the center, that's, you create a folder on your file system, and then you want to put content into that. You can use any application on your computer to create the content. Dialog would be one of those applications that would change the content of your folder. Git, Photoshop, Notepad++, any other application on your computer could then look at the content and modify it. What Git does is allow you to put or move your changes to the cloud. or bring changes from the cloud to your local folder. Photoshop would allow you to edit an image. Dialog IDE allows you to change the source code. So if you think of it in terms of the folder on the file system as the center, and Dialog being a tool that allows you to modify the content, it might be easier to see how it's related.
Yeah, but how do I see who's responsible for managing that source?
It's you.
So you have to talk to the rest of your organization about that. I mean, you couldn't see that in an APL workspace. You load an APL workspace, it's got 10,000 functions in it. Who's responsible for what? You have no idea. In fact, with a tool like this, it's much easier to find out because if you point it at a given folder, it will tell you who changed, Morten Kromberg changed this in the 15th of March, 2018. You can see everything that happened. You can go back and look at the history.
Yeah, but I would have to know that I have to go to Git to look for that.
But that's true for any way you organize anything. You have to know somewhere to go to find out who's responsible. The workspace doesn't tell you either. Right? Yeah, it's a new way of working that you need to learn about, but it gives you incredible control. And for example, if we look at this, so I can say, okay, I didn't like that. Right click on it, discard, poof, gone. Is it? Why is that not gone? Now my system is hung. Oh, no, it just took a little while because it needed to talk to GitHub, I suppose. If I go back into my APL workspace now. Okay, JD's editor discovers that it's changed, right? So the comment is gone. Yeah. If I say, in fact, yeah, JD's got a little bug there. If we go back here, okay, so here's the change I made on the 15th of March, where I replaced this old code, which I'm sure many of you still have in your lowercase function, that creates an alphabet of the letters that you know about, and not the Swedish ones, and converts them using dyadic iota. And I removed those 4 lines of code, and I replaced them with 819 IBeam. And then I find out, oh shit, this code has to run on version 14 of Dialog APL, where that IBeam doesn't exist. All you have to do is go to this line here and double click on it. And it says, checking out this commit, well, it warns you that you're creating a detached head. You're moving back past the beginning of the GitHub thing. And it takes you back to the 20th of October. And if you now edit the LC function, you've got the old one, right? Because the sync, but this isn't because the link mechanism knows anything about GitHub. It's because GitHub modified the contents of that folder that it's managing. And the link mechanism just picks up any change that happens to that folder because it's been told to link a given namespace to a given folder, right? So there's 2 really completely separate chains of responsibility. Now, it may be that we decide we want to have a user command that allows you to look at the links you have and find out the Git status of them, right? There are probably good arguments for that, and I think we probably will do that just so that you can sit there in APL and you can say bracket link minus Git status, and it'll tell you, oh, this one isn't managed by Git, and this one is, and these are the changes, so that you can maybe just a little bit more quickly get stuff.
I generally see this helpful, but if other people are familiar with GitHub, I've got most of my last year or two's work up in GitHub repositories. Happily demonstrated to you to anyone else who'd like to see this at some point later.
Yep. And me too. I haven't done anything in the last 3 years probably that isn't a GitHub repository of some description. I mean, the tools group at Dialog APL has everything in GitHub. The C code is still managed in SVN because for historical reasons. It may move at some point. Steven?
I was fascinated to see the first link command that you showed was linking a folder into the root. My highly esteemed colleague, Jaeger, would take issue on this and does with me. in his view, kind of one of the most experienced developers.
Yeah.
Anything you import into your application should be to a distinct namespace. All references to should be absolute references.
You're welcome to do that. It works with that.
Yeah. I'm curious about this, and I'd like to get your views and that of others in the room. In my experience, I think Kai's arguments for working this way are very good. In my experience, every developer and every developer shop, shall we say, has a set of functions which you use in every application, utilities. If you follow Kai's prescription, you're going to put those into some namespace or Google, and every time you use one of these things, you're going to write it #u. Then the name of the utility. And I find this at a minimum distasteful and annoying.
Yep.
And prefer if my utility is called where, that I write where rather than #. I find it seriously interferes with the legibility code. It depends. To do what I do successfully depends on me and anybody else I know recognizing what is effectively a local extension of the APL language. Because if you use where utility that way, then you have to know this effectively becomes in this development environment a reserved name. That's bringing it.
Yep.
I wonder what your views are.
So this very much sort of moves over into Gil's topic and dependencies and so on. The thing we're working on trying to design for version 18 is something that will be, maybe we'll call it CoreXPath, which will be similar to quad using that you use to load .NET repositories. And what this is saying is, you know, take this source file. And this isn't necessarily how the syntax is going to be. We haven't started arguing about this, but there are sort of three parts. Here's the source. Here's where I'd like you to load it into the workspace. And here's what I'd like to be able to refer to it in my code, right? So if I set QuadXPath to that, then in my code, I'd be able to say s.lc. Yeah, doesn't work, of course. Not very. And if I didn't set anything there, then I'd be able to just use lc. This is identical to the way quad using works with .NET libraries. That you can say the prefix that you wish to use, how much of the namespace that the .NET thing is in. And it's yeah, I said there was one big thing we need to solve, which is the array notation for constants. The other big thing is this, because we want to be able to do what Kai recommends, which is that you load these things all into their proper place, but we don't want to litter our code with the hash.utils.strings.lc, because that makes the code unreadable, right? I mean, semantic density thing, right? If half of your code is the name of where things are, the code is unreadable.
Unreadable is maybe a little strong.
It's hard to read. Yeah, I don't know who was first.
Will functions made available in this way then show up when you try to list your functions?
Right. You should come and sit in the design discussion for this thing. We'll probably review it with you at some point. Yeah. No, there are lots of very, very good questions. I mean, there is already a thing called QuadPath in Dialog-APL, which has numerous flaws. One is that it has session scope. It can't be different in different namespaces. And then the dialog editor and all sorts of different parts of the APL system don't recognize it properly. So if you put the cursor on a name and hit Shift-Enter, I think maybe in the last couple of releases, the editor goes and finds it. But for many years, it didn't. And that really put people off using QuadPath. What we hope to do with QuadXPath is going to be QuadPath done right. We're going to look at, using statements in Python and C# and other languages. Yeah, Adam, I think.
I don't quite understand why the second part, the utils.strings. Why do I need to put it somewhere? I just want this thing in that file to be.
You need to put it somewhere because, for example, there might you might want to share it and call it different things in different namespaces.
But why do I need to put it anywhere?
Because
Can I answer that?
okay, sure.
I think this is probably wrong. You take two things into one. That should be split into a link statement.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, you're right.
Linking
No,
your
that's
code
correct.
into a space, and then using XPath to link
Gil is correct.
a space to.
There are two distinct steps. One is load this thing into there, which is what Gil is going to talk about, I think, at some length. And then there's and what do I want to call it in this part of my application, in that part of the application? I mean, Kai's comment that everything should go into a namespace. I would agree. If we're a development shop and we're big-time developers, there's dozens of us and we're developing stuff, I would put everything into a namespace. If you're an APL programmer who wants to write functions like the ones that are in the root here, do I have to think of a namespace that I'm going to put this in? I mean, you're just making my life miserable now. It makes sense that this thing is in a namespace because it's not part of my application. But having to put everything in a namespace seems to be like it's actually, it's not always appropriate. It is for big scale development, but it isn't. And even then you might want to have stuff in the group.
I'll talk about it later, but yeah. I think in general, if what you're saying, if you're developing a tool, then you should wrap it in a space. Yeah.
Oh, tool, yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Two questions. If you have already a function in your workspace and try to link it to a folder which has the same function, what happens?
Yeah. That is as yet undefined.
Okay.
Yeah. Because I mean, you saw I had to, when I got into the position where I had to reset my links because there was a bug and I had to do it again. Yeah, here. I explicitly told it a link hash to this folder, and I want the source to be the directory rather than the workspace. So the values for this can be ns for namespace, dir for directory, or both. And I'm not sure what happens if you specify both. Certainly names which only exist in one place, but we really don't want to get into the business of trying to do merges because that's the domain of, there are specialist tools for that. We could work for months in APL and we could make some crappy merge tool that people would just weep when they tried to use if they used anything proper.
But Morten, what about Shadow?
Sorry?
What about Shadow?
What about Shadow?
Yeah, you can have an experimental new version of something, you can shadow it.
Right, so I mean, I think you're thinking there of if you wanted to merge two namespaces into the same space.
Yeah, isn't that what we talked about now?
No.
You said if you had name documents.
Right, but that's if there's a name in the workspace and there's also the same name on file, and you create the link having the same thing pre-existing. So it's not an empty starting position. Got stuff in both locations. Then there's a potential conflict. You might have the function foo in both places. And
yeah.
This isn't, you're thinking of the way that IP shop Logos used to work, where you could have multiple source folders in a hierarchy, and then you'd have your production system, and then the development code would be a bunch of files in the development folder, and then you would shadow them so that if there was stuff in the test folder, it would overwrite what was in there. It's like a kind of a patch. And the way you would do that today is you'd use branching and other mechanisms in Git and source code management systems to achieve the same effect. You wouldn't use that particular mechanism. I mean, that was a pre-source code management or pre-modern source code management tool, I'm sure. It worked well, but there are better ways to do that.
You wanted to go back a little bit to the thing about why they need to decide where to put it, and also mention you can't you're talking about, you have a one-to-one link between namespaces and files on this, but really, there's nothing preventing you from having two different namespaces linking to the same file. And then when something changes in one namespace, it, of course, it reflects on the
I think we should move on, and then there's time set aside for discussion.
what I wanted to say with it is, instead of choosing where to put it, let's say I want S here, where I am, to be that folder over there.
Yeah, and you should wait until Gil's done his bit before we continue that discussion, because I think he's going to talk about multiple versions of things and putting them in automatic locations and then being able to reference them. Yeah. Okay. So, Gil, the master of time now. I'm about... Okay, so we don't need to talk about how it works. It's magic. I mean, it uses there's an editor fix callback in the APL system. So whenever the editor saves something, you get a chance to get in and write it to a file. What's different now is that we've explicitly exposed that function so that if you have a program that makes modifications to source code, you can call this quadec.link.fix with your new source code, and it will treat it in exactly the same way as if you'd made change in the editor. So people like Kai who make search and replace tools, and anybody else who does, I can see people, toolsmiths nodding here. People who write tools will be able to just hook into this. And the same thing when it comes the other way. There's a file system watcher, which only works on Windows. We're looking at finding a way to do that cross-platform for version 18. Again, you can be called before the link mechanism does anything to have a look at any file system changes. So I know there are people who have stuff out there in XML files or JSON files or .charmat files, their own formats. And you get a chance so that if somebody edits an XML file externally, and that's something that Link doesn't really know how to do anything about, you get a chance to grab that event, define some variable perhaps from the XML or whatever you need to do, and then tell Link, don't worry about it, I've taken care of it, kind of thing. Yeah, that's these hooks on read and on write. Right, so I have debuild and how much time do you want? Carry on. So here's the, I think this is worth doing. So the summary of all the modifiers for this link command at the moment. So it takes two arguments, a namespace and a directory. And then we've seen this one, source equals. So you can say if they're not both empty, there's stuff in them, consider the namespace or the directory or both. And I'm not sure, Adam, what happens if you specify both at the moment. You might want to disallow that. Or that it just says, well, okay, I'll deal with the stuff that when there aren't two copies of the same name, but if there are two copies of the same name, I give up, you deal with it.
If you haven't changed anything, the way I implemented it was it just starts off in the workspace, putting everything on disk and then the other way.
Yeah, and that's probably not going to be what people want. You can tell it which side to watch. So do you want to look for changes in the namespace, the directory, or both? The default is both. This is something that's going to change. We're talking, and this is something that might be worth discussing over lunch. Currently, we're only dealing with files that have an extension of .dialog. The Acre source code management uses .class, .function, .script. There needs to be some meeting and thrashing out of a set of extensions that we're all going to use, ideally, for the same thing. I mean, you can override it. You have hooks to override it. But we really want to get to a position where all dialog users, at least, if not all APL users, are using the same extensions so that you can add logic to that. Flatten is something we've done for a very large customer who has 6,700 folders containing various modules in the application. But they actually want them all loaded into hash. They don't want to have a namespace because that's the way the application looks today. They want to start using this now. and they don't have time to refactor some number of millions of lines of code. So flatten will just load everything into hash, and then if you create a new function, the automatic saving of it doesn't work. It's going to ask, you're going to take the on write callback and write your own logic that maybe pop up and say this new function foo, you know, where does it belong? Which of the 6,700 modules should it go into? We started off with this on, asking the user to verify all synchronization, and we very quickly got tired of it. Particularly if you renamed a folder in the file system and you got 1,000 notifications of file name changes, got very tedious. Reset removes an existing link, and then there are those hooks that we mentioned. So the purpose of the link mechanism, the way we think of it now, is only this. It's only this. Keep source in the workspace synchronized with files, file structure which is similar to the namespace structure that you have in the workspace. It takes care of, it doesn't yet take care of everything because there are certain things in the APL environment like creating a new namespace where we don't have a hook. And maybe we don't want a hook because if Quad NS always called this system, your application might slow down. Yeah, we've talked about all of this, but it does handle things like renaming, although that creating folders didn't work in the demo. It will allow you to rename a folder and it will rename the namespace and everything will work. It is not a source code management or project management system, right? It expects a source code management system below it, like Git, SVN, and it expects a project management system on top of it to decide which links to make. Yep. It's only responsible for the synchronization. That doesn't mean that you would necessarily use a source code management system or a project management system. You could just have a folder and be messing around a bit. And like my ANAP there, I don't have, it's not managed by GitHub. I don't need something to describe that project. I just think of this folder as being my workspace. I link it and I work with it, and that's it. I'll zip it up every time I need a backup. But for the people who write project management systems, it won't just be available as a user command. There'll be a proper API that can be called. Yep. So now I have a few more slides on something called debuild and detest. I love the name of the last one. It's just, I thought of that. I think what I'll do is, so we've been using these internally. We desperately wanted to move some of the code that we ship with the product to GitHub, starting with version 16. And we needed something that would allow us to transform folders full of source into workspaces that we could ship. And we wanted to be able to test them. And I think I'm only just going to show you a couple of, just spend 3-4 minutes on this and then hand over to Gil, just to show you the kind of thing that they do. This is a very complicated one, the most complicated one we have, which builds the Conga version 3 workspace. So this is a text source file that describes how to do a build. So the stuff at the top is just metadata. Then there's some defaults. So that works around that problem with setting Quad-IO, Quad-ML, etc. What this will do is make sure that any namespace that gets created is going to have that as the default inside them, if nothing else is defined. And this is the target. So we're going to create a file called this when we're done. Then exec is just a line of APL code to execute. So this is just here because I wanted to run it over and over again, and I wanted to make sure that I didn't expunge everything before I started. And then there's statements here. There's a namespace statement or a class statement. There's a CSV statement. The namespace ones just say, well, in this folder, star.dialog, target equals, that means create a namespace called DRC and put everything you find in there inside it. And nearly everything is a copy of that. When we get down to the classes, it's a single file, and we're saying which namespace to load it into. And then because we have some error tables, so this is our, again, working around the problem of not having a data format. We have a bunch of error tables. And so we wrote a CSV statement that would read those as using quad CSV and convert them into a matrix, because that was a very convenient format to edit. Just an error number and a text. And then an LX statement to set quad LX. So that's the build. And this was done in an afternoon, right? This was not carefully researched. So I'm expecting more from Gil, who's had a good, he's been sitting back and trying to get the 10,000 meters view. So here's a simpler one, the isolate workspace. There's only 3 statements. There's, at the end, I do a hash.build. I call a function that is, and then I expunge it. And what the build function does is it does a git command to find out the current revision count of git, and then it inserts that into a variable called version so that we can see exactly which git commit that this workspace was built from. Yeah, so we've spent too much time. Maybe I'll come back to these later if people are really interested. And then we built a very, very simple test harness where there's only 3 different kinds of statements. There's setup, which is some code to run before you run the tests. There's teardown, which is some code to run after you've run the tests. And then there's a list of test functions that you want to run. And the test functions, here's a setup function. So this is for isolates. So it defines a function in the test framework if you're running version 16, because it knows it isn't going to be there. So this is a workaround. Ignore that. And then it just does some isolate configuration setup. Says user runtime, signal errors, and use 4 processes regardless of how many there are on the machine. So that's the setup configuration. And then here's a simple test where some of the setup is repeated. And then it's just doing things with isolates, and it's checking that it's getting the right result, and then it's failing with a specific error message if things fail. So it's just a very simple framework, a sort of a DSL where you can write APL code to do anything you like, and then there's these fail and check functions. And then if the test function returns an empty vector, it succeeded. If it returns any text, then it failed, and that text is the... So you have 2 ways to fail. You have a fail where you say, well, give up, or you can collect messages and return them. And that's gotten us to where we are now. And I'll stop talking. Well, I mean, we've had a little bit of the discussion as we went along, so maybe it's not just pure overrun. But we actually have on GitHub now, Dialog has a couple of 1.5 dozen public projects, and then we have another dozen internal projects that are not visible to the outside world for things that we're doing internally. But we're really trying to get into a position where all of these tools, like Link is also out there as a GitHub project, and Gil has made commits to it. Yay! So things that we're doing. In version 17, there's going to be Link. Quad fix has been enhanced so that you can fix both. We don't have to use quad fx for functions and quad fix for namespaces and classes. Regularize things a bit. So this is for people who have very large functions and want to be able to do Git merges, right? The problem with APL, or one big problem with APL relative to the source code management systems, is that the automatic merges do really well if you don't have 2 people modifying the same line of code, right? They're really good at doing line-oriented diffs. But if you have 1,000-line APL functions and 10 people working on it, then it's likely that every person who changes a line is almost certainly also going to change line 0 to add a local variable. And so we're allowing you to have start lines after the header with semicolon and then more locals, so that people can, and a comment at the end, so that people will be able to, if they're just adding locals or they're locals related to a particular subpart of the function, they'll be able to get automated diffs in many cases, many more cases.
Invent a statement called :local, and then you can list up the names there. Then have several local statements.
Yeah.
Then you don't have this like zero project that goes.
Yeah. Yeah, it could be that some more explicit, like a :local. At the moment, :local is just semicolon. If the first character on a line is semicolon, that means exactly the same as :local.
Anywhere in the
At the moment, because this is sort of a little bit of a rush job, it's only the first few lines. They all have to be at the top of the function. You can have comments. Yeah, which is important. Yeah.
And that's in 17.
That is in 17. That went in yesterday. That went in yesterday.
Okay.
Yes. We have a large customer who I know would not forgive us if it was not in version 17. Nobody mentioned. And one thing very, very important, everybody who's heard about this is just clapping and cheering. It used to be such that if you tried to define a class like this and the base class wasn't defined already, or the namespace that you were including wasn't defined already, the fix would fail. And that's a problem if you have a bunch of files in a folder and you fix them in alphabetical order instead of in somehow computed dependency order. Then, I mean, we have code, and I know customers have code, which run through in a loop, fixing stuff until there are no errors, right? So you just do, you loop through once, 3 of them fail, you loop through again, 1 of them fails, finally they all succeed.
Will this work for scripts as well?
Scripts in the sense of?
Same problem. You know, stuff in the script, where you have dependencies, but the order of the
You mean a namespace script? Yes. The namespace script can't have dependencies.
Well,
no.
I mean, if you have classes, yes. If you have classes in the namespace script.
Yeah. What I would say to you there is, do not use the ability, although it is there, to run code on fix. You will regret it at some point, even if we were to. I mean, there's no way we can fix that. Right? You could have dependency on something that isn't.
Even if it is, then the order of the components in the namespace script determines whether it fails.
Right, but we can't tell when it's going to be there. It might not be in the same folder. It might be in some other folder. You might have a dependency on.
Sorry, what Klaus is saying is he has one namespace script
with
multiple class definitions within it, and if the order of the classes currently
classes in a namespace script. Yeah, yes. That should work. Yeah. I thought you were calling functions in your initialization and expecting that to work. Yeah. Again, I would say I wouldn't do that if I were you. If you have a script like that, I would move away from that. I would start moving to a more regular structure and have them individually.
You should follow your own advice with Kromberg.
Yeah, we should. So the way the system used to work has sort of forced people in that direction, but I would slowly try and move away from that. Yeah, sorry, I promised to stop. So here's a promise. Going to keep talking to Gil and the AK developers and really sort all of this stuff out so that Dialog is supporting the existing. I mean, there is one existing sort of, I wouldn't say widely used, but used by more than one company, which in APL terms is widely used. Text-based source code management system. And we want to make sure that all Dialog users are going to be able to share source files and as many tools as possible. And for version 18, it's file system watcher on all platforms. The array format, I think, is very, very important. And we're going to, hopefully we'll get some help from this from the, well, I mean, Gil's already done it for VS Code, right? Sort of. Or you're halfway there?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. Notepad++ would be good to have APL syntax coloring for. Nearly all of these tools have regular expression-based, and you can't always do a great job with APL because you need to know runtime information. But you can do better than nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah. GitHub has something. Yeah.
GitHub does.
Yeah.
It's just
And,
the colors are unfortunate.
Also, GitHub automatically recognizes that code is written in APL and we do statistics on the project and say so many % of your code is APL code.
Yes.
Will it recognize anybody's APL code or only some people's APL?
I've tried throwing strange stuff at it. And seems to be very good at it.
Yeah. Anyway. Oop. Well, thanks for having part of the discussion as we went along. That means we're not as late as it might seem. This is a platform. I don't know if it's a good common platform. But anyway, thank you very much. Thank you.